Got it.
Hi, everyone. This is Barrie Friedland, and I'm with Jacob Kravetz. Don't Shop on Tuesday. You know that often we go national or international, and then we return home to talk to people that we are watching and respecting, and so grateful for their what they're doing. And today we are talking to a Lutheran pastor who's also my city council person. So it is a very, very wonderful marriage of faith and service and community. And Mark Parker, thank you for chatting with us today.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Jacob. Great to be here, and glad to be your council person.
So am I, and I know that we did have Z Cohn on, who's president of the city council, and we did have Odette Ramos on, who as a Latina woman,
We've been racking them up because we also had
Ryan Dorsey.
Ryan Dorsey on. So now we're gonna soon have most of the council have come on.
Absolutely.
But we especially wanted you so you can talk about faith and service and community. And I think that is a very important marriage today, since so much of it, if you pardon the term, is being blasphemized, in every aspect of that. We are tearing apart communities. We have faith that is hurting people, and we have service that is not service, public service.
Absolutely.
That's selfish.
Well, yeah. So let me give a little bit of my background then for those who don't hang out with us here in Southeast Baltimore. Mark Parker. I grew up here in the city of Baltimore in South Baltimore, a neighborhood called Otterbein. Both my parents were in public service. My father, a public defender, circuit court of Baltimore City for most of his career, and then my mom had a master's and then PhD in nursing and worked at University of Maryland Hospital there. So grew up surrounded by public service, and especially public service that was deeply rooted in Baltimore, right? Not just kind of a generic like, oh, sure, like, oh, my mom served in the army, right? I mean, there's all kinds of ways to serve, but very rooted in the city. And it was really closely tied to where we grew up. So I grew up in a neighborhood called Otterbein, which was created in the aftermath of one of the worst decisions the city made, which was to try to destroy huge chunks of the city to run highways through it. And they destroyed some, but then eventually there was a big enough fight and resistance, and the road got stopped. And my neighborhood, where I grew up, was left. They had already kicked all the people out, but they hadn't torn down the buildings. And so the city government under William Donald Schaefer raffled off the houses for $1 a piece. It was an urban homesteading movement in the mid 70s. And so my parents, my family got the house for $1. The shell, I mean, it spent 5 years, 4 years, 5 years fixing it up and working really hard to do that. But so I grew up in a neighborhood in Baltimore City, which was where the people who lived there had physically built their houses themselves, or directly oversaw that taking place, and also had to form a brand new community at the same time, because the buildings were built in the 1840s, but the neighborhood started in 1975, in a really intentional way. And so I grew up both with that example of public service for my parents, but also grew up in a community that was shaped by the failures of government policy and also by the hard work of individual people working alongside the government to try to build something out of the wreckage of failed past policies. And so, and I grew up in a church that was 3 blocks away, that was deeply committed to the well-being of the city. And so that meant building a huge subsidized senior apartment complex on the Inner Harbor, 9 stories tall, full block long, a few hundred units, building a specialty hospital for folks needing long-term care, starting first a soup kitchen, then it became a homeless shelter, and then it became a shelter for women and children, then it became an entire program with a transitional housing across the city and job training and all the rest to work with women and children and help them rebuild their lives. And so I grew up in a neighborhood and in a family and in a church that were all located within 3 blocks of each other, and that all were emphasizing and teaching me public service in Baltimore. And this is what it looks like. And it's not just one thing, but it's all these different ways that you can and ought to and have and have a Christian obligation, in my case, a Christian obligation to consider how you use your gifts, time, energy, skills to contribute to the well-being of your neighbors as best as possible. So that for me then led me to serving as a pastor in Highlandtown. I've had that distinction or that position for 16 years this summer. August 1st was 16 years. And then that also meant running for office. I ran for office in 2016 for city council and did not win that election, but learned a ton about my neighbors, about my community, about public policy. And then I think the video cut out for a second. 1 second, friends. The audio should still be good.
The audio is still good. Yeah.
Yeah. And then ran for office again in 2024 and was elected to city council in that fall election, the spring 24 primary and the fall election. Yeah, that's kind of where things come together. I'm mindful that the first time I ran was during Donald Trump's primary, when he was kind of building steam and marching through the Republican primary. And it meant that as I was out knocking on doors across the district, I was having really, I was meeting lots of really energized people, and some of them energized obviously by dislike for Mr. Trump and what he stood for at the time and even now. But then also lots of people in Southeast Baltimore at the time who thought he was great, just fantastic, and a breath of fresh air. And we don't really like immigrants in our community anyway, and he tells it like it is, and all this other bullshit that we were hearing at the time. But was hearing that Southeast Baltimore is the most politically diverse. The first district is the most politically diverse district in the city of Baltimore. It's still 2-1 Democrat to Republican, but the city overall is 9-1, right? And even among Democrats, especially 2016, especially 9 years ago, even the Democrats then at the time had lots of people that were Democrats because that's what they always had been, but it didn't necessarily reflect where they were politically these days, right? Especially some older households, some retired households, some union households, things like that, where the political tenor had really shifted over the years. Even though they were still Democrats.
Mark, not to mention the new affluence that was coming in Southeast Baltimore.
Yeah, there's plenty of that, but that tended to not mean, so a lot of those folks are simply registered Republican, right? So the people that I ran into who were registered Democrats who were espousing really conservative views were mostly legacy Democrats who had drifted away from kind of the values of the party, or felt like the values of the party had drifted away from them, but those were the folks who were, outside of that, I wasn't actively, I wasn't knocking on doors of independent and Republican registered voters just because they couldn't vote in the primary. And so I had fewer conversations. And here we go. So I had fewer.
When you were talking with, well, I guess, you can finish your story around, I guess, how that's stayed the same or changed in the intervening years. Yeah.
It was profoundly different this time. And partly that's because of 4 years of Donald Trump and people getting a sense of like, oh, it's not just, oh, haha, he's funny, or I am amused by him, or I think he's different. It's like, oh no, he's a disaster, right? So there's 4 years of that. There's also demographic change going on. I mean, I mentioned most of those households were older households, kind of legacy Democrats in Southeast Baltimore. 8 years later, a lot of them weren't here anymore. They had died, or they had moved away, or whatever the case may be. This is a really dynamic part of the city. New people are moving in from around the country and around the world all the time. And so I think for both of those reasons, I think people realized what was at stake in having a president as disastrous and potentially tyrannical as Donald Trump. And the electorate continues to change and evolve, gets younger, gets more diverse in some ways. So, yeah.
I always, to go back there and then come into the horrible present where we live, I'm always complaining that it's always a lesser of two evils. But 8 years ago, it was an embarrassment of riches. I think we had 4 very good candidates running. That,
Your race she's talking about. Yeah.
I'm talking about your race, obviously not. Yeah, I'm talking about 2016 first district, Baltimore City, where one is now Z Cohn, who is president of city council. One is a delegate, and
Delegate Mark Edelson. Yep.
Edelson, and Scott Goldman is working with veterans. And
So he was, and now he's chief of staff to the Maryland Department of the Environment.
there we go.
Yep.
And then you became our councilman. So I had the opposite problem 8 years ago in my election that I usually have. And this time, and we mentioned it briefly with Zeke, one of your major opponents was funded by the Smith family, who owns the Sun Papers and a restaurant cabal. And not only did you leave him in the dust, but we also defeated that horrible charter amendment about reducing the size of the council. So kudos on, and we're happy you're here. Now, I think we need to move up to 2025.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. There was something there, some thread I was gonna pick up.
I wanted to
Yeah.
just ask quickly, Mark, around if there was, you've seen demographic changes. There were some older sort of Democrats who weren't necessarily the most progressive in the 2016 election. Some of those are disappearing, but were there through lines in terms of across across the elections that you've run? You said you learned a lot. What did you find were very cross-cutting and materially resonant to people, across those categories? And was it the same? Was it different, 8 years ago to today?
Yeah. So 2016 in the city of, I mentioned the context of Trump. I would be remiss to not also mention the more important context in Baltimore, which was the death of Freddie Gray at the hands of police in the spring of 2015. And not only that, but the uprising and the violence and the kind of criminal behavior that followed shortly after. But then also an incredible upsurge in violence that was sustained across the city for most of the next decade until we get to about 2023, and our current public safety strategies, community-based public safety strategies, finally start to bear some results. So from 2015 to 2022, Baltimore was the most violent from a shooting and murder standpoint than at any point in the history of the city. And it was awful. And still every murder, every act of violence is awful. But the city in 2015, 2016 had a sense of, we really felt like we'd figured some stuff out and had begun to make real progress on some of our issues. The city was growing. 2010 to 2015, the city population had grown. Murders had stayed, had hit a low of 178, and had hovered in the low 200s, which was dramatically better than what had come before, what came after. There was a sense of optimism and dynamism in terms of the city economy and culture. And then post Freddie Gray, it was a huge shock to the system. Violence shot up. Things went on hold. The presidential election was confusing and then downright alarming. And the city really entered kind of a spiral after that point. And so people, even in the 2016 election, were worked up, not just about national issues, but were concerned and confused and upset about where the city stood. They were upset about police violence and about racism, systemic racism. They were upset about violence in the community. They were upset about all kinds of things that all of a sudden didn't. It kind of like things that we had thought were figured out. We quickly realized we hadn't made as much progress as we needed to, and so it was disconcerting. So coming into then, um, 2024, people were in a much, not only the demographic changes and kind of everything we mentioned about Trump, but in terms of their attitude towards Baltimore City, there was a sense that we were emerging from that really fairly disastrous set of 7 or 8 years. Um, I thanks to Mayor Scott and a bunch of other people who are working really hard on things, violent crime was decreasing. The city population has stabilized for the first time since 2015. We lost 35,000 people net between 2015 and 2020. And that continued into 21, 22, and 23. So it wasn't until we got to 2024 that the city population stabilized, that violent crime was coming down significantly. And we had a sense that we had done a lot of work on education. We had come through the pandemic, a lot of the disruption of the pandemic, where finally felt like we had sorted some stuff out. And we'd had consistent mayoral leadership. I mean, between 2015 and 2020, we had 4 mayors in 5 years, right? I mean, it's just absolutely from chaotic from a political standpoint. Um, Only one of those mayors was convicted of a crime, but the rest, we had a mayor who didn't run again, and then we had a mayor elected and resigned under threat of prosecution, and then we had an interim mayor who ran for reelection and didn't get reelected, and then we had Mayor Scott win. So 4 mayors in 5 years. So by the time we get to 2024, Mayor Scott had a full term. He was able to make real progress on some key things around the city. We had made it through the pandemic. So people were feeling much more, at least in this district, feeling much more positive, not silly, not in a silly or like fanciful way, but they know how hard the past decade had been, and they were seeing real signs of progress, and they were excited to be part of it. And so it was a much more positive attitude and constructive attitude. Okay, well, what comes next? Like, how can we keep making progress? Like, what kind of investments can we make? Can we finally tackle some of these vacant housing issues and education issues that had kind of been on the back burner because we were so focused on violent crime for so long? And I think that's continued, right? I think there's been a sense that there's some stability and consistency in leadership on the council and in City Hall with the mayor's office, um, and also in the broader community. I think the biggest challenges we're up against these national headwinds, right? Like Baltimore can only do so well. It's great that we have a General Assembly and a governor who are deeply committed to the well-being of Baltimore, right? I mean, that's vital.
A breath of fresh air.
Yeah, especially after 8 years of Larry Hogan, right? Like, but having a federal administration so hostile to places like Baltimore and people like Baltimoreans, Black and brown communities, immigrants, folks who are genuinely trying to find creative solutions to longstanding problems. The hostility of the federal administration, not just in its political rhetoric, but in its actual decision making around budgeting, around immigration policy, around federal law enforcement, around healthcare. Um, that that's our biggest hurdle. I mean, we have plenty of our own internal hurdles, but we know them, and we have strategies to work through them. But doing so at the same time that we're always looking over our shoulder to see what foolishness or idiocy or downright terrible decisions are going to come down from DC is hard, right? To say the least. I don't know, hard isn't even the word, but
Our email today is about the Epstein files, and the diversionary tactics that he's doing is horrific. And Jacob and I were talking earlier that I think he's going to invade every big city in a blue state. I mean, I think he's going to send the National Guard to Chicago and to New York and to Baltimore. And it's just a diversion. And I think we were in his sights because our governor is a man of color, so we're already, and this is a Democratic stronghold. So you add all of that. And so I'd like you to talk about, he's threatened to invade Baltimore. He's also threatened to withhold the monies to repair the Francis Scott Key Bridge.
yeah, absolutely. So I was on my way to family vacation. We were traveling, when the Sunday to Monday kind of like social media BS started, where Baltimore started getting mentioned, and where the decisions were announced about Washington D.C., which obviously is just 40 miles to our south. Um, and my staff, like, they were like, because this is my first vacation as a council person, they were like, okay, well, when do we call you? When don't we call you? I was like, if it's going to be in the news, call me. And so, like, I hadn't been gone 24 hours and my phone starts blowing up. I'm like, okay, fine. But like, but they were right to call me. I was like, oh my God, because we were working on this joint statement with all the other elected officials and everything. Okay. Um, yeah, I, what's the word? Is the word terrifying? Um, the the use of the National Guard uh, in uh, in our urban centers for no real purpose except to make political theater at the expense of the civil rights and the well-being of American citizens and in complete disregard for the law is is a pretty alarming and terrifying thing. Um, the threats to Chicago, to Baltimore, to other cities, what's already taken place in DC, what's already taking place in Los Angeles. Um, I mean, the Trump administration will do everything they can to get away with whatever they can to, advance a white supremacist agenda, advance a purely partisan agenda, advance um, we're going to do everything we can to build and control and take power until someone tries to stop us. And it's not clear, it's certainly not Congress. And the stops that might come from a deeply conservative Supreme Court come so late and so tamely as to not do much to protect us from a slide into authoritarian rule. Um, yeah, so it's I mean it's deeply concerning, and I think that for people elected office, for people in community leadership in one kind or another, for people who simply live in a place, um, to try to not only navigate the reality that we're dealing with now, but to try to game plan out, okay, what are the limits for what we're willing to accept, and what are the avenues that we have to object to or to attempt to halt such authoritarian actions.
So as you're exploring, there the withholding of funds and sort of the that sort of monetary disciplining is a little bit different. It's along the same lines. It was a little bit different from, deploying troops within a city and potentially how you respond and the tools that you can use to respond to those are look very different. Um, one thing I am wondering, I don't know if there have been any discussions around, for instance, if the federal government is going to start using the money that it would normally grant to states to properly develop and sort of keep up with with the times, if they can no longer be counted on to not just not do that, but to potentially withhold in a punitive way funds. Is there discussion at either the state level or at the city level? I don't know around either changing balanced budget amendments or issuing some sort of bonds to try to, raise money, or do alternative sources of trying to undo some of the handcuffs potentially around that a lot of states have sort of placed themselves in with balanced budget amendments and a variety of other sort of things that norms around that are holding us back from being able to properly protect citizens.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. I mean, the biggest challenge is clear at the state level, especially around healthcare, and to a certain extent around education. Um, on a local level, we've had some success so far with legal processes to fight back and regain control over funds that were properly allocated by Congress, and that the president doesn't actually have the ability to deny. The deeper we get into the administration and the more kind of compliant Congress gives him, that cuts off future funds, means that there's more shoes to fall financially. But thankfully, the courts have been somewhat helpful in addressing kind of illegal takings or cancellations of disbursements. I know the state is incredibly worried about the fiscal situation. The state of Maryland, I mean, there's a few dynamics here, right? One is we have an outsized impact of federal government shrinking, or at least parts of the federal government shrinking on the economy and workforce employee base here in the state. And so the state has to be deeply concerned about that. And there's some things particular, not only to Medicaid in general, but also to the way that Maryland has the authority to set its own reimbursement rates in hospitals. That gives us a lot of control over price here, and that too may also be taken away from us by the federal government, which would cause a massive escalation in healthcare costs in the state of Maryland. So there's that aspect on the state side. Also, Maryland tends to be a really conservative, fiscally conservative state. In terms of in terms of maintaining its credit rating, in terms of being really, really careful with how it manages its budget. And so emergency situations like this kind of cause a strain for us as our elected officials try to figure out what our options are, given how we have always done things, or the values that have guided our decision making. And so I don't envy them that. I haven't heard what the details would be. There was some conversation around a special session, but those conversations seem to have faded for some reason. I don't have an explanation why. They were talking about doing it this fall, precisely to address kind of the budgetary implications of the big beautiful bill and other things coming out of DC. On the city side, we're especially vulnerable in a few areas. The health department's the most vulnerable. Over half that budget, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, comes from federal grants, and a bunch of those are already gone or quickly disappearing. Education has a big impact, and that's one of those places where, thanks to legal action, we were able to claw back money that had been canceled, money that had already been spent for after-school programs and out-of-school care. And the final place, and this is where, I mean, there's nothing rational. The Trump administration has never pretended to be a rational actor in any way, shape, or form. It's a purely political actor and a reactive, emotional actor in all these things. But we have a ton of federal partnerships and federal resources flowing to help us address violent crime in Baltimore. And those resources and partnerships have been a big part of our success. And those are exactly the things that the presidential administration, the Trump administration, is cutting. And then they'll also say, but your city's too violent, so we're sending in the National Guard, right? And this is where the whole thing is ludicrous. Like, you gave us money, you gave us support, we worked with you. We have a federal consent decree that we've been working on for a decade, right? Like, and now we're showing real progress, like sustained year over year over year, real progress on violent crime. And now you're going to cut the funding that helped make that possible, and then also send in troops. So, I mean, it doesn't.
And the cost of those troops is astronomical, and they're taking it from the places that could best serve the citizenry. I just want to add an amendment to your history lesson, which was very important to hear. During most of that time, we had a Republican governor who hated Baltimore City.
Yep.
And Maryland, there used to be a meme on the internet, a dress, whether it was white or blue. And that's how blue Maryland is. Sometimes it's hard to detect. And we elected a man who clearly hated Baltimore, who I've never met him, but everything he did or said was racist, corrupt, cruel, or inept. He stopped our red line, our subway, and our current mayor, who was president of city council at the time, he went to a statewide meeting, and Baltimore wasn't on the map of Maryland. There was a whole map of Maryland minus that thing. So, as we were going through that really rough time, we had a governor. For part of the time, we had a president who didn't care about us. We had governor who didn't care about us. I'm just so thankful he's not a U.S. senator now. And so what can we do to educate people? I mean, it was very fascinating how you talked about the difference between 2016 and the second time you ran. As I get older, I get more progressive with every breath I take. But I know that the Disraeli quote still applies. If you're not liberal when you're young, and the heart. If you're not liberal if you're not conservative when you're older, you have no brain. But how do we continue to educate? And this is not just for Baltimore City, but for everyone, to educate people on the real issues, on the true public servants, the people that come here to serve and to help, rather than to avoid crime and to avoid jail. I mean, what would you suggest?
Oh, about immigration in particular?
Well, immigration or, immigration, yes. And I think, how do we educate people about the unconstitutional legal, but how do we educate voters to make better choices?
Sure. So I'll do both of those then. So I appreciate you sharing your story, and while speaking generalities, didn't want to imply that. And we have tons of very progressive older adults in the district, and so it's not simply a question of age in any way, shape, or form. I think our most progressive folks are actually often our older adults. There's quite a crew in Canton. There's a huge crew in Butchers Hill who are practically socialists, which is delightful. So that being said, what can we do generationally? And Barbara and Jacob, I'm curious about your impressions. Having been deeply involved in a lot of the organizing and reacting and protest in the 2017 to 2020 period, as a pastor, right, a pastor of a progressive justice-seeking church, working close with the immigrant and refugee community, right? The energy and the organizing feels really different to me this time around, early in the Trump administration. I'm not saying because it's less, but it is certainly less mass action and more on the ground kind of like harm reduction resistance. And I think that demonstrates a really important shift, but also a real seriousness of purpose and a real understanding that that the work that we're going to have to do is going to have to be highly local for it to be effective and for us to survive, essentially for us to survive as a democratic society, as a healthy, diverse, pluralist democracy in our local communities, in our city. And so I'm encouraged by that. Early on, I was like, where are the big marches in DC? Where are this, they, that? And I'm like, no, I don't think it's simply that people are discouraged, although they are. But I think also people have learned a lot, be like, hey, those photo ops there don't save our neighbors, but accompanying them to their immigration hearings does. Tracking ICE activity through the community does. Making sure that people are fed and have housing, and that we're helping people who are struggling with healthcare, because helping people navigate through the harmful and destructive decisions is our top agenda. And so I'm really encouraged by that, and also I see a hunger of people to do that, right? Not just where can I show up and protest. And the No Kings event in Patterson Park was amazing and fabulous and really encouraging. And the work that is happening every single day around the community is vital. And that's where people learn. You said, how do we teach? Well, that's where they learn. They learn because we did legal accompaniment training, 2 different sessions here. We had 70 people here on Sunday, and we had 55 here 3 weeks ago. right? These are neighbors who are like, how, okay, this is something I can do to show up alongside my neighbors and help protect them and keep them safe. Um, so I think that's the key is helping people take, I care about my neighbors. I see that they are suffering. What can I do to help? And that's where it always begins, right? That's where public service always begins. It's like, here are my neighbors. How can I listen to them, learn from them and their experience, and put myself on the line for their well-being. Um, and that ties into, so the second part was the immigration part. And so that's a big part. I mean, I think it takes on a special prominence here in the first district. I mentioned it's the most politically diverse district in the city. It's also by far the highest percentage of foreign born. We have twice as many foreign born residents by percentage as any other district in the city. And that is tons of Central Americans and Caribbean folks in the Caribbean and folks from South America. It's also tons of Greek and Italian and Polish migrants who came here post World War II and still live here and still speak there. I mean, my block has at least 4 different languages spoken on it, like between 12 houses, right? So it's not simply the newest generation of migrants, although that is a huge part of what we're doing. Our schools here in the district are somewhere between 50% and 90% Latino, right? I mean, it's a central part of our identity. And so then like all of the news about immigration policy, all the news about ICE raids and enforcement actions, all the stuff about Kilmar, Abrego Garcia, it's not just, oh, I care about that because I'm a progressive, liberal, democratic person. I care about these things. It's like, no, like my kids' classmates are losing their parents, right? And that gets people fired up in a way that no amounts of intellectual or spiritual commitment to the general concepts could. And so it really does increase the urgency here in this district in a very particular way, in a way I'm grateful for, right? I'm grateful for the ways that the neighbors are showing up for each other, and seeking to do that better.
You know, it's a real shift from just theoretical ideas and values based to material conditions helping, on the ground, which, as you're saying, is much more serious in many ways. I mean, there are a place for big protests, but I think, though that's what gets sort of held up as big demonstrations for past movements, but what gets left out of those stories, right, is all of the daily work, right, and all of the little things to build the solidarity and and strength of movement around the country to be able to manifest in those ways, but not just have it be flash in the pan, but have it be sustained.
Right.
And
No,
so, yeah, I think that's fantastic. And just really sort of reminds me to come full circles that your family and your start in Baltimore was from people taking on, a very adversarial government that did not care about the people of the city, and was literally tearing it down and destroying it for bigger plans, right, as part of their bigger plans. And the power there of, if by building community, by taking regular action, by building solidarity and staying together, that that we can gather hope from that past story, right, in terms of lessons for today, in terms of fighting the oppression right now.
right. And so just to lift up, so one of the key organizers of that was a social worker here in Highlandtown and Canton named Barbara Mikulski, right? And who then was elected to this seat on this. Well, she represented this district on the city council, and then she was elected to Congress, and then served in the Senate in a very distinguished career, right? And so, and not just her, but that fight, that hyper local fight, galvanized and built real power among Italian, Polish, Ukrainian, Greek immigrant communities who up to that point had felt ignored or left out of the American political system. And the organizing that led to the road being canceled then carried forward into all kinds of political organizing and social efforts across this entire swath of the city. And so, to your point, that spark created an entire generation of leadership and drove community change that wasn't just about that issue, right?
And that road was stopped. That, you know, Barbara and Mikulski was able to stop that road. They wanted to take I-95 and just connect it and demolish neighborhoods that are very vibrant now. You know, just Town and Canton and Fells Point, and you know, so that was a spark, and that did energize your career. I'm going to let Jacob close up, but I have to say this for the third time. I love the food in Southeast Baltimore. It is the absolute best.
It is. It is. From around the world.
And I think, you know, again, to thank you so much for joining us. And to wrap this up, you know, I think what really struck me around the activity that you see in Baltimore and people getting involved are that, you know, specificity in terms of the story, in terms of Barrie often likes to say, you know, the best story wins. But I think that you know, the specificity of that story, the anchoring of it into real people, into local lived experience, really does galvanize people. And that humans are not fact-telling creatures, they're storytelling creatures. And so if we're going to, you know, if we're going to reach them, you know, we need to make material action linked to stories that, you know, are real and matter to them. So, you know, I want to thank you so much for having, you know, dedicating, you know, so much of your life and time to service of one way or another. And we're going to need you, you know, going forward, because it's going to be quite a ride for all of us together to try to make it through this. So really, thank you so much for joining us, Mark.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Barbara.
And thank all of you for joining us. And until next time, don't shop on Tuesday.